This past Saturday, over 100 CEOs and corporate leaders virtually met to discuss how to respond to new controversial voting laws, including the one that was implemented in Georgia. They discussed, quote, potential ways to show that they oppose the legislation, including by halting donations to politicians who support the bills and even delaying investments in states that pass the restrictive measures.
So, founder of Maestro PAC, president and founder of Solidarity Strategies, author of T.O. Bernie, and former senior advisor for the Sanders campaign, Chuck Rocha, and White House reporter for Real Clear Politics, Philip Wegman. They join us now to discuss. Phil, this has been a fascinating dynamic for us to observe because you have, I believe this was like CEOs of like the 100 most powerful corporations or whatever in America coming out in favor of this legislation and essentially creating like a political PAC sort of behavior, which has caused a lot of Republicans, rhetorically, to say, well, now we're against big business, or at the very least, we're against these specific companies, but not our friends in the oil companies, and et cetera. How is the right navigating this? Because it seems ideologically incoherent at this moment.
So this is an interesting question, obviously, because Republicans like the idea of stepping into this new brand, which is that they are anti-woke capital, that they are the ones who are going to stick it to corporations. And there has been a little bit of an awakening on this, as we saw in Georgia. You had Georgia take away United's tax cuts for jet fuel. You had Texas consider doing something similar. You had Mitch McConnell come out there and sort of do a shot across the bow where he says that we shouldn't have a woke corporate parallel government. And then what happens? We kind of figure out that the emperor doesn't have any clothes, because it's hard to argue that you are going to be the party that's going to hold woke capital accountable at a moment when you're saying, don't you dare increase the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, right? That's a difficult case for them to make. At the same time, though, I think that there is a risk of some of these companies pushing conservatives and Republicans too far. Clearly, there's an appetite within the Republican base, which is saying, no, why are you helping out these corporations which are lecturing and hectoring us about our voting laws here in the United States? And yet, where are their factories? Where are they making all of their investments? They're making them in China. So the Republican Party is an interesting spot because they don't seem to be too serious, other than in rhetoric and one or two specific instances of actually doing something in holding corporations accountable the way their base would want. But I'm saying that base has an appetite for this. And what I'm most interested to see is, do these corporations, which, let's face it, are focused on their bottom line. That's what they're focused on more than anything else. Like, do they go too far? And then the backlash from the conservative base is such where Republicans actually do have to show up and use the stick, not the carrot.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other thing that's awkward for Republicans is that these laws restricting voting rights are not popular, right? And we covered here also, like, H.R. 1 is extraordinarily popular, not just with Democrats, but overwhelmingly with Republicans, to the extent that Koch network was like, we can't even make the case that billionaires shouldn't be buying elections, so we should just kind of try to kill this thing behind closed doors. But Chuck, let me ask you the flip side question, which is, how's the left navigating this? Because it's also uncomfortable to have like big corporate America suddenly on your side and cheering for your team and saying, hey, we're going to back you guys and not the Republicans, when, look, like Phil said, ultimately they're cynical. They think this is a good look for them politically. They think that it's good for their bottom line. What do you think that those tensions look like on the left?
It's just made me think about all the fights that I have had in primaries where we went after quote unquote establishment or corporate Democrats who were in the pockets of big companies. And Krista, you can remember these primary campaigns where the left loves to say that this moderate Democratic congressman has been taking all this money from Exxon and Walmart and corporation A, B, or C. And now these corporations want to be seen as woke, progressive, trying to hold the line for civil rights integrity. And I think a lot on the left don't know what to do with it, right? I think they're going to continue to use the framing around civil rights and around justice and around the fairness of the issue. I don't think you're going to see them doing any kumbayas with the corporations, but I do think you'll see people like Color of Change, who really started this movement in the Black progressive movement, holding corporations accountable around asking people not to buy those products if they're supporting lots of racist things that didn't support Black Lives Matter. So I think that that's where you're going to find the movement itself. But at the end of the day, remember, this has everything to do with money, and Phil's right about a lot of this just being rhetoric. As we've known since I've been doing this for 31 years, the corporations have always lined up behind Republicans because Republicans have always looked after their well-being when it comes to the tax rate, when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to anything, to Phil's point, about the bottom line, because that's where this whole thing has always been.
Yeah, it's fact. Chuck, let me just follow up on that, because on this tension, how is it going to play out? Isn't that, I noted I thought it was very intentional that Biden is the first Democratic candidate in, I think 2 decades to pledge a tax rate of over $400,000, not $250. $250 was Barack Obama's floor and Hillary Clinton's. At the same time, it's funny, I was just looking at Axios. The second line was about this voting thing. The third line was CEO pay surges in the pandemic. CEOs of the largest companies hit $13.7 million last year. So from your perspective, in terms of the tensions within the Democratic coalition over this, how is that going to play out? Not just in the infrastructure package, but really as we move forward, maybe into some quote unquote boom times when you're going to see corporate CEO pay and more probably hit levels that we haven't seen historically.
I think you're going to see it play out in the midterm elections around messaging and the way that we talk to working class voters of lots of different skin colors who are out there making it work every day, who really haven't felt a lot of this wealth that you've seen build and have really taken it on the chin when it comes to this pandemic. And I was watching a program last night, I think it was on 60 Minutes, that talked about how many jobs have been lost in the restaurant industry and how some industry is booming and while other will never come back. Well, a lot of those middle class, lower middle class jobs, a lot of them, ironically, that would have been really beneficial to $15 minimum wage aren't coming back at the rate that they should. So it's how Democrats message us in a boom time, because it's just not going to be a boom time if you're middle class, lower middle class, and just really trying to build wealth to even get into the middle class. So how you message that to a group of voters who were super anxious and super been hurting a lot, even those same group of people that Donald Trump reached out to, I think is a big deal because he tapped into that, the visceral, I don't know what's next.
Yes. Yeah. And Phil, finally, on your point about how serious is anyone really about this, I looked up the numbers after Mitch McConnell was like, corporate CEOs stay out of politics. And of course, the number one recipient of money from corporate CEOs in the last election was Mitch McConnell. Number 2 was David Perdue of Georgia. So to your point about this only goes so far for the Republicans, but do you think corporations ultimately are actually serious about withholding their donations from Republicans like Mitch McConnell, if Perdue were to make another run or the other Republican senators or members of Congress? Do you think that they would actually withhold their donations and, give up what's a key piece of political leverage and how they were able to basically take over everything in America?
Well, Crystal, remember that corporations are people until corporations are progressive people, and then that's
right.
when there's a problem.
That's
and
right.
I think that what we're seeing is...
Hobby Lobby, still a people.
Yeah, that's right.
Amazon, not so much.
Right.
So, corporate America has to decide how much skin they want in the game. I think that you saw a number of CEOs hit the talk show circuit explaining where they were on the Georgia law. They didn't seem necessarily too persuasive. Some of them certainly didn't seem to have a grasp of the particulars of the bill itself. Others seem to be voicing their consternation after the fact, not before. They be careful that as they put forward this compassionate, caring face, that the consumer doesn't just say, wait a minute, I asked you to provide me shoes. I didn't ask you to provide your ideal voting rights law. I think that, with corporations getting more and more involved, there's a risk of them coming off as phony. And they, in the back of their minds, this is just an analysis of, are Republicans or are Democrats actually serious about, making us feel the heat somewhere else? Right now, we have a lot of rhetoric and not much else.
It's going to be, it's fun to watch play out. Okay, guys, thanks very much. We appreciate it. Next on Rising, Zed Jelani joins us to discuss the recent departures from Substack. That's when Rising continues.